He only wanted her for one night. He didn't know who he really was. An aging widower thought this night would be nothing more than quiet conversation over tea. But the woman sitting across from him wasn't there by chance. She knew his past, a past he didn't even remember. She tells him the drowning boy he once saved grew up to be someone extraordinary, someone who carried his blood, a son he never knew existed, a son who's now gone, but left behind something that could change the rest of his life. And just when he begins to feel the pride of a legacy he never claimed, a hidden truth in a sealed letter threatens to tear it all away. What happens when the life you thought was yours turns out to be only half the story? And will he have the courage to become the man his son always hoped he'd be? Write in the comments what you had for lunch, and click subscribe to this channel. You will be lucky in life. Samuel Grant sat in his worn leather armchair, the flames from the fireplace casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, the autumn wind whistled through the eaves of his small coastal home, rattling the windows in their frames. His weathered hands cradled a cup of black coffee, but his eyes were fixed on the photograph he'd propped against a stack of books on the side table. Sarah's smile beamed back at him from the silver frame, the same warm, gentle expression she'd worn throughout their marriage. Even after 10 years, the sight of her still made his heart ache. The photograph had been taken during their last summer together, her dark hair streaked with silver, laugh lines crinkling around her eyes. The shrill ring of the telephone cut through his contemplation. Samuel considered letting it ring, as he usually did, but something told him it would just keep ringing until he answered. Only one person was that persistent. "Hello?" he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Samuel, I knew you'd be home." Tom Reynolds' cheerful voice boomed through the receiver. "Listen, you're coming to the charity dinner tonight, right? The whole town will be there." Samuel pinched the bridge of his nose. "Tom, you know I don't do those things anymore. That's exactly why you need to come. You can't keep hiding away in that house forever. Sarah wouldn't have wanted that." The mention of his late wife's name made Samuel's jaw tighten. "I'm not hiding," he said, though they both knew it wasn't true. "I just prefer my own company." "Well, prefer it tomorrow night instead. Tonight, you're joining the land of the living." Tom's voice softened. "Come on, old friend, it's just dinner. If you hate it, you can leave early." Samuel sighed, knowing resistance was futile. Tom had always been like a dog with a bone. "If I say yes, will you stop nagging me?" "Scout's honor," Tom replied, though Samuel distinctly remembered his friend getting kicked out of the Boy Scouts after 2 weeks. "Fine. What time?" 6 o'clock at the town hall. Wear something nice." The line went dead before Samuel could change his mind. Looking down at his coffee-stained sweater and worn jeans, Samuel realized he'd have to make an effort. He trudged upstairs to his bedroom, where his navy blue blazer hung in the back of the closet, protected by a plastic dry cleaning bag. He couldn't remember the last time he'd worn it. The blazer still fit, though it felt stiff and formal after years of wearing work clothes. He paired it with a clean white shirt and gray slacks, running a comb through his silver hair more out of habit than vanity. The mirror showed him a man he barely recognized anymore, someone who looked more like his father than himself. The walk to the town hall took him along the waterfront, where the wind whipped up whitecaps on the harbor. Fallen leaves skittered across the sidewalk, and the setting sun painted the clouds in shades of amber and purple. Samuel walked with his head down, hands thrust deep in his pockets, nodding briefly to the few people who recognized him. The town hall's windows glowed warmly against the darkening sky. Samuel paused at the bottom of the steps, already regretting his decision to come. But he could picture Tom watching for him through the windows, ready to march out and drag him in if necessary. Inside, the hall hummed with conversation and laughter. Round tables draped in white cloths filled the space, each decorated with autumn flowers and flickering candles. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread made his stomach growl, reminding him he hadn't eaten since morning. Samuel scanned the room, spotting Tom's gray head bobbing through the crowd near the bar. Before his friend could spot him, he quickly made his way to an empty table in the far corner of the room, where the shadows from a large potted plant provided some cover. A server appeared almost immediately with a plate of food and a glass of water. Samuel nodded his thanks, grateful for something to focus on besides the cheerful chaos around him. The chicken was surprisingly good, though he ate mechanically, more from necessity than enjoyment. As he cut into his green beans, he felt someone's gaze on him. Looking up, he caught the eye of a woman seated at a table across the room. She appeared to be in her late 50s, with silver-streaked brown hair styled simply around her face. Her blue dress was elegant but understated, and there was something quietly confident in the way she held herself. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she offered him a small, genuine smile, not the practiced social grin most people wore at these events, but something warmer and more natural. Samuel found himself nodding slightly in acknowledgement before she turned back to her conversation partner. He returned his attention to his plate, but something about that brief exchange stayed with him. Perhaps it was the lack of pity in her eyes, or the way her smile hadn't demanded anything from him. Whatever it was, he found himself glancing in her direction again, though she remained engaged in her conversation, occasionally laughing softly at something her companion said. The sounds of the charity dinner continued around him, the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversations, the occasional burst of laughter. Samuel sat in his corner, finishing his meal in solitude, though he was acutely aware of the woman's presence across the room, like a warm light at the edge of his vision. As the evening wound down, Samuel watched people begin their slow migration toward the coat racks. Chairs scraped against the floor as guests stood up, exchanging final pleasantries and goodbyes. He seized the moment to make his own escape, pushing back from the table and grabbing his blazer from the back of his chair. "Samuel Grant, don't you dare sneak out without saying hello properly." Tom's booming voice carried across the emptying room, making several heads turn. Samuel's shoulders tensed as he heard his friend's footsteps approaching. When he turned around, Tom wasn't alone. The woman in the blue dress was with him. "Samuel, I want you to meet someone," Tom said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "This is Clara Whitmore. Clara, this is my oldest friend, Samuel." Clara extended her hand with that same warm smile she'd offered earlier. "It's nice to meet you properly, Samuel." Her handshake was firm but gentle, her hand warm against his calloused palm. Up close, her eyes were a deep brown, filled with intelligence and something else, a kind of knowing that made Samuel slightly uncomfortable. "Clara just moved back to town last year," Tom explained. "And like you, she spends far too much time alone. I thought you two might have something in common." He glanced between them with poorly concealed satisfaction. Samuel shot Tom an irritated look, but Clara laughed softly. "Tom's subtle as a foghorn, isn't he?" The honest observation startled a chuckle out of Samuel. "That's being generous. I'd say he's more like a freight train." "Well, my work here is done," Tom announced, backing away with a grin. "Don't let him escape too quickly, Clara." They watched Tom disappear into the dwindling crowd, leaving an awkward silence in his wake. Samuel shifted his weight, trying to think of something to say that wouldn't sound forced. Clara saved him the trouble. "I noticed you sitting by yourself earlier," she said, gesturing to his corner table. "I almost came over to join you, but you looked like you wanted to be left alone." "I usually do," Samuel admitted, then winced at how unfriendly that sounded. "I mean, I'm not very good at these social things anymore." "Neither am I, to be honest." Clara glanced around the room. "Would you like to sit? The chairs haven't all been claimed by the cleanup crew yet." Samuel found himself nodding, and they moved to a nearby table. The remaining guests had clustered near the entrance, leaving this corner relatively quiet. "So," Clara said, settling into her chair, "how long have you lived in town?" "All my life, except for when I was working offshore." Samuel surprised himself by elaborating. "I was a marine engineer, spent a lot of time on oil rigs and cargo ships." "That must have been fascinating." Clara leaned forward slightly, her interest genuine. Did you ever see any whales up close? The question transported Samuel back to a morning 20 years ago, when a pod of humpbacks had surfaced near his rig in the North Sea. He found himself describing the way their breaths had misted in the cold air, how their massive bodies had gleamed in the early light. Clara listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that drew out more details. Before he knew it, they were trading stories about the town's history, the great storm of '82 that had nearly destroyed the pier. The summer the traveling carnival got stuck here for 2 weeks because their trucks broke down. I remember that carnival. Clara's eyes lit up. The fortune teller set up shop in the old hardware store and started giving better business advice than the Chamber of Commerce. Samuel laughed, the sound surprising him. Mrs. Peterson swore by that fortune teller's stock tips until the day she died. Their conversation flowed naturally to books. Clara mentioned she worked part-time at Hartley's bookshop on Main Street. It's perfect for me, she said. I get to be around books all day, recommend stories to people, and still have plenty of quiet evenings at home with my tea and reading. Hartley's, Samuel mused. I haven't been in there for years. Used to love that back corner with the leather armchair. It's still there, Clara smiled. Some things don't change. Though we did finally fix that squeaky floorboard by the mystery section. That's almost a shame, Samuel said. That squeak caught many kids trying to sneak reads of the scary books their parents wouldn't let them buy. Clara's laugh was warm and genuine. You sound like you speak from experience. Guilty as charged. I used to save up my paper route money to buy adventure novels. Samuel found himself smiling at the memory. The owner, old Mr. Hartley himself, would always pretend not to notice me reading half the book before I bought it. He sounds wonderful, Clara said softly. Like he understood what books mean to a lonely child. Something in her tone made Samuel look at her more closely. There was a depth of understanding in her expression that went beyond mere sympathy. Before he could respond, there was a loud clatter as the staff began stacking chairs at the next table. Samuel glanced at his watch, surprised to find that nearly an hour had passed. Most of the other guests had already left, and the cleanup crew was moving efficiently through the room, transforming it back into its everyday self. He looked at Clara, suddenly reluctant to end their conversation. She was gathering her purse, preparing to leave, and Samuel felt words rising to his lips before he could stop them. He cleared his throat, trying again. Would you like to continue talking somewhere else? The question hung in the air between them, and Samuel fought the urge to take it back immediately. But Clara's face softened into a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. The autumn night wrapped around them like a blanket as they walked through the empty streets. Their footsteps echoed off brick buildings, mixing with the distant sound of waves from the harbor. The streetlights cast long shadows, and a cool breeze carried the salt-tinged air inland. Samuel's house came into view, a modest 2-story structure with weathered gray shingles and white trim. A small porch light illuminated the front steps, welcoming them home. The sight of it made Samuel suddenly self-conscious about the peeling paint and overgrown bushes he'd been meaning to trim. It's not much, he said, fumbling with his keys. But it's home. Clara smiled, pulling her cardigan closer against the chill. It's lovely. These old harbor houses have such character. Inside, Samuel flicked on the lights, revealing a living room that was neat but sparse. A few family photos dotted the walls, their frames collecting dust. His late wife's reading glasses still sat on an end table, untouched for years. Would you like some tea? He offered, grateful for the simple ritual to occupy his hands. That would be wonderful, Clara said, following him to the kitchen. Do you have chamomile? Samuel opened a cabinet, pushing aside old coffee tins. Somewhere in here. My wife used to keep. He paused, then found the yellow box tucked in the back. Here it is. The kitchen was small but tidy, with worn countertops and a round table by the window. Clara settled into one of the wooden chairs, while Samuel filled the kettle. The familiar motions of making tea helped steady his nerves, measuring the leaves, finding clean mugs, arranging everything on a tray. The wall clock ticked steadily in the background, marking time in the comfortable silence. Samuel noticed how naturally Clara fit into his kitchen, as if she'd been there before. There was nothing awkward about her presence, nothing forced about the quiet between them. "Sugar?" he asked, setting the mugs down. "Just a touch," she smiled. "Thank you." Steam rose from their cups as they sat across from each other. Through the window, moonlight sparkled on the harbor waters. The scene felt surreal to Samuel, having a guest in his home after so many solitary years, especially one who seemed so at ease. "I used to love watching the boats at night," Clara said, following his gaze. "The way their lights bob on the water, like stars that fell from the sky." Samuel nodded. "Sometimes I sit here for hours, just watching them come and go, especially the fishing boats heading out before dawn." "Do you miss being out there?" she asked softly. He considered the question, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Parts of it. The sense of purpose, maybe. The feeling that what you do matters." He paused. "But mostly I miss who I was back then, younger, surer of everything." Clara's eyes held understanding. "Life has a way of making us less sure as we go along, doesn't it?" "That it does." Samuel traced the rim of his mug with one finger. "Though sometimes I wonder if we're just more honest about our uncertainties as we get older. Or braver about admitting them," Clara suggested. The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on life's bigger questions without feeling heavy. They talked about missed opportunities, paths not taken, the way time seemed to speed up with each passing year. Clara spoke about her own regrets, a marriage that ended too soon, a career change that came too late, the children she never had. Samuel found himself sharing things he hadn't talked about in years. His wife's illness, the lonely aftermath, the way he'd gradually withdrawn from everything except his work. Clara listened without judgment, offering gentle questions that helped him articulate feelings he'd never quite put into words before. The tea grew cold in their cups as the hours slipped by. The wall clock chimed midnight, startling them both. "I should probably go," Clara said, though she made no move to leave. Samuel looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "I have a confession to make," he said quietly. "I invited you here because, well, I just didn't want the evening to end." The admission hung in the air between them, more vulnerable than he'd intended. But Clara's expression remained warm, understanding. She set her cup down carefully, folding her hands on the table. Her face grew serious, and something in her eyes changed, a shift from casual conversation to something more purposeful. "Samuel," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "there's something I need to tell you." She met his gaze directly. "I know who you really are." Samuel's frown deepened, creating lines across his weathered forehead. The whistling kettle pierced the silence, making him jump slightly. He stood up automatically to remove it from the heat, grateful for the momentary distraction from Clara's unexpected words. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, his back still turned to her as he fiddled with the kettle. His hands, usually so steady from years of detailed marine work, trembled slightly as he set it on a cork trivet. Clara waited patiently while he returned to his seat, her hands still wrapped around her cooling tea. The kitchen felt smaller now, more confined, as if the walls were drawing in around them. The gentle tick of the wall clock seemed louder than before. It was December 1975. Clara began, her voice soft but clear. "The harbor had partially frozen over during an unusually cold spell. You were working at Marshall's shipyard back then." Samuel's expression remained guarded, but something flickered in his eyes, a flash of recognition quickly buried. He said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "It was late afternoon, almost dusk," Clara went on, watching his face carefully. "The sky was that deep winter gray, and most workers had already gone home. But you were still there, finishing up some welding work on the stern of the Peterson fishing boat." Samuel's hands tightened around his mug. That's a long time ago." "You heard the crack first?" Clara continued. The sound of ice breaking, followed by a splash and a scream. A boy had been playing too close to the edge of the dock, testing the ice. He'd fallen through. The color slowly drained from Samuel's face. His eyes took on a distant look, as if seeing something far beyond the kitchen walls. "I don't." He started, then stopped. The denial died on his lips. "You didn't hesitate," Clara said. "You dropped your tools and ran. The boy had gone under by then. The current was pulling him beneath the ice. You dove in after him." Samuel pushed his chair back slightly, the legs scraping against the linoleum floor. His breathing had become shallow, and a muscle twitched in his jaw. "The water was so cold it felt like thousands of needles," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "That's what you told the paramedics afterward. You said you couldn't feel your limbs, but somehow you kept swimming, following the dark shape under the ice." "Stop," Samuel said hoarsely. "Please." But Clara pressed on, her voice gentle but insistent. "You broke through the ice with your fists, making a path. You caught him by his coat, just as he was losing consciousness. When you pulled him out, your hands were bleeding from the ice, but you wouldn't let go. You held him until help arrived." The kitchen fell silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and Samuel's uneven breathing. He sat perfectly still, staring at his hands spread flat on the table, strong, calloused hands marked with the scars of decades of maritime work. And perhaps, though it was hard to tell now, some thin white lines from that winter day so long ago. "How do you know all this?" he finally asked, his voice rough. "Because that boy lived," Clara said simply. "He survived thanks to you, and he grew up to do remarkable things." Samuel shook his head slowly. "I never knew what happened to him. After the ambulance took him away, I just went back to work. Never heard anything more about it." "You didn't want recognition," Clara observed. "You didn't even give your full name to the paramedics." "It wasn't about recognition," Samuel said, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "But they didn't," Clara said firmly. "You did, and that boy, he never forgot. He spent years trying to find out who you were." Samuel pushed himself up from the table and walked to the window. The harbor lights twinkled in the distance, much as they had on that winter evening decades ago. His reflection in the glass looked haunted. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked without turning around. "Because that boy survived and thrived," Clara said. "He became someone important, someone who made a difference in countless lives. And he wanted you to know that. He wanted to thank you." Samuel turned back to face her, his expression a mix of confusion and growing unease. "Wanted? Past tense?" Clara nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "Yes. He wanted to find you for a very specific reason." The wall clock continued its steady ticking, marking each second of silence that stretched between them. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the faint sound of harbor bells. "I don't understand," Samuel said finally. "Why didn't he just come himself? Why send you?" Clara's expression softened with something that looked like sympathy mixed with determination. "Because he couldn't," she said quietly. "But he made me promise to find you, to tell you the whole story." Samuel sank back into his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "There's more, isn't there?" "Yes," Clara said, reaching across the table as if to touch his hand, then pulling back. "There's much more. That boy, he grew up to be someone very special. Someone connected to you in ways you couldn't have imagined when you pulled him from those waters." Pale morning light seeped through the thin curtains of Samuel's kitchen window, casting weak shadows across the worn linoleum floor. He hadn't slept more than an hour or two, his mind churning with the revelations from the night before. The coffee maker gurgled and sputtered, filling the kitchen with its familiar aroma, the one constant in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. When he shuffled into the kitchen, still in yesterday's wrinkled clothes, he found Clara already seated at his small table. She looked as tired as he felt, her silver-streaked hair slightly mussed from sleeping on his lumpy couch. The blanket he'd given her was neatly folded on the armrest. "Morning," she said softly, offering a gentle smile. Samuel grunted in response, reaching for 2 mugs from the cabinet. His hands moved automatically through the morning ritual. Pour, add sugar for her. He'd noticed how she took it last night. Black for himself. The ceramic clinked against the table as he set the mugs down. "You didn't have to stay," he said, lowering himself into the chair across from her. "I didn't want you to be alone with all this," Clara replied, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Not after everything I told you." Samuel stared into his coffee, watching the steam rise in lazy spirals. "It doesn't feel real," he admitted, "like some kind of dream I might wake up from." "I know," Clara said. She hesitated, then reached into her bag that sat beside the chair. "There's something else you should know, Samuel. I didn't come to that dinner by chance." He looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "Your son, Michael, he left something for you," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "Something important. It's in the city where he lived, where he built his life." Samuel's fingers tightened around his mug. "The city," he repeated flatly. "You want me to go there?" "I promised him I would bring you," Clara said. "He wanted you to see what he created, to understand who he became." Samuel pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window, his shoulders tense. The harbor was visible from here, the morning fog still clinging to the water's surface. It was his anchor, his constant. The thought of leaving it made his chest tight. "I can't," he said, his voice rough. "I can't just leave." "Why not?" Clara asked quietly. "Because," he struggled to find the words, "because this is my home. My life is here." "A life you've hidden in," Clara observed, but there was no judgment in her tone. "When was the last time you left the harbor, Samuel?" He didn't answer. They both knew it had been years. "I'm afraid too," Clara admitted, surprising him. "I was afraid to come find you, afraid of how you might react. But Michael believed in you. He believed you deserved to know the truth, to see what your act of courage that day made possible." Samuel turned back to face her, his expression conflicted. What if I'm not what he thought I was?" "You already are," Clara said simply. "You proved that the day you jumped into those frozen waters without a thought for yourself." Samuel sank back into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his years, the weight of decision pressed down on him like a physical thing. "When?" he asked finally, his voice barely audible. "Today," Clara replied. "Now, if you're willing, before fear has a chance to change your mind." Samuel looked around his kitchen, at the familiar coffee maker, the old clock on the wall, the stack of maritime magazines by the window, his sanctuary for so many years, his hiding place. "I'll need to pack a bag," he said slowly, each word feeling like a step into unknown waters. Clara's face softened with understanding and something like pride. "Just the essentials. We won't be gone long." Samuel moved through his house like a man in a dream, gathering clothes and toiletries into an old duffel bag. His movements were mechanical, automatic. A change of clothes, his medication, a worn paperback he'd been meaning to read. Each item felt somehow significant, as if he were packing for a journey much longer than a few days. Clara waited patiently, giving him space to process. When he finally emerged with his bag, she was standing by the door, her own small suitcase beside her. "Your car or mine?" he asked, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. "Mine," she said. "I know the way." They loaded their bags into her sedan, a well-maintained older model that spoke of careful ownership rather than luxury. Samuel locked his front door, then paused, his key still in the lock. "I haven't left this place in 3 years," he admitted quietly. Clara touched his arm gently. "Sometimes, the hardest journeys are the most necessary ones. The car started with a reliable purr, and Clara navigated the narrow streets of the harbor town with careful precision. Samuel sat rigid in the passenger seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. As they passed the shipyard where he still occasionally did consulting work, he found himself holding his breath. The town began to fall away behind them, buildings growing sparser, the road widening. Clara turned onto the coastal highway, and Samuel twisted in his seat to look back. The harbor was shrinking in the distance, the familiar skyline becoming smaller with each passing moment. The lighthouse that had guided him home so many times was now just a tiny white needle against the gray sky. A strange sensation settled in his chest, part terror, part exhilaration. He didn't know if he would return as the same man who left. Perhaps that was the point. Rain drummed steadily against the windshield as Clara's sedan cruised along the coastal highway. The wipers swept back and forth in a hypnotic rhythm, pushing aside sheets of water that obscured their view. They'd been driving for nearly 2 hours when Clara spotted a weathered sign advertising May's Diner, home cooking, just ahead. "How about some breakfast?" she asked, already signaling to turn into the gravel parking lot. "I could use a coffee refill." Samuel nodded, realizing he was hungry despite the knot of anxiety in his stomach. The diner was a classic roadside establishment, its red vinyl booths visible through rain-streaked windows. A neon "open" sign buzzed in the window, casting a warm glow against the gray morning. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, the aroma of coffee and bacon wrapped around them like a warm blanket. An older waitress with graying hair pulled into a neat bun looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Sit anywhere you like, folks," she called out, already reaching for 2 menus. They chose a booth near the window, where they could watch the rain fall on parked trucks and cars. The vinyl seats squeaked as they settled in, and Samuel found himself studying the laminated menu without really seeing it. "The French toast here looks good," Clara said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving town. Samuel set his menu down, folding his hands on the table. "Tell me about him," he said quietly. "About my son." Clara's expression softened. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small photo album, placing it gently on the table between them. "His name was Michael," she said, opening to the first page. "Michael James Cooper. His adoptive parents gave him the Cooper name, but he knew about you. He found out when he was 25. Samuel stared at the photograph of a man with his own jawline and his mother's kind eyes. The similarity was striking, yet this was a stranger's face. A face he should have known. The waitress approached with coffee, and they quickly ordered French toast for Clara, eggs and bacon for Samuel. When she left, Clara continued, her finger resting on the photo. "He had your way with boats," she said, smiling. "Could fix anything that floated. But he used that skill differently than you might expect. He started a program for troubled kids, teaching them how to repair and sail small boats. Said it gave them something to be proud of, something that was theirs." Samuel's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "He worked with kids?" Clara nodded, turning the page to show a photo of Michael surrounded by teenagers in life jackets, all grinning aboard what looked like a restored sailboat. He believed in second chances. Said everyone deserved the opportunity to rebuild themselves, just like those old boats. Their food arrived, steam rising from the plates. Samuel picked at his eggs, his attention fixed on the photos Clara shared between bites of French toast. Michael at college graduation. Michael teaching a young boy how to tie a bowline knot. Michael receiving some kind of community award. "He was stubborn," Clara continued, dabbing maple syrup from her lips with a paper napkin. "Once he set his mind to something, there was no talking him out of it. The community center was his dream for years before he made it happen. He wrote grant proposals, organized fundraisers, convinced local businesses to donate materials, wouldn't take no for an answer." Samuel felt a familiar ache in his chest. "Like his mother," he said softly. "She was the same way." Clara's eyes met his across the table. "Would you tell me about her?" Samuel pushed his half-eaten breakfast aside, his fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on his water glass. "Sarah," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so many years. "She worked at the library near the shipyard. Used to bring books to the workers during lunch breaks. Said we needed poetry in our lives, not just engine manuals." He paused, lost in memories. "We were young. Too young, probably. I was wild back then, angry at the world. When she told me she was leaving town for college, He swallowed hard. "I pushed her away, told her to go, live her life. I never knew she was pregnant," Clara finished gently. Samuel nodded, his throat tight. "It was easier to run," he admitted. "From feelings, from responsibility. I did that a lot back then. Got in fights, quit jobs, moved around. Couldn't stand still long enough to let anything hurt me." "But you changed," Clara observed, gesturing to the photos. "You saved him that day at the harbor." "I didn't even know it was him," Samuel said, his voice rough. "Just saw a kid in trouble and acted. Maybe that was the first time I didn't run." Clara reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly. "That moment shaped his whole life, Samuel. He never forgot it. Even before he knew you were his father, he told that story, about the stranger who jumped into freezing water to save him." They fell silent as the waitress cleared their plates. Outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle patter. The morning crowd had thinned, leaving them almost alone in the diner. "He loved sailing more than anything," Clara continued as they waited for the check. "Said he felt most alive when he was on the water. He had this old sloop he'd fixed up himself, called her Second Wind. Used to take the kids from the center out on day trips, teach them navigation, teamwork." Samuel listened, trying to piece together this image of his son, this man who had taken the best parts of his parents and built something meaningful with them. Each story was a glimpse of what might have been, what should have been. The miles rolled by as they continued their journey, Clara's stories filling the car with echoes of a life Samuel had never known. The rain eventually cleared, giving way to a watery sunshine that gleamed off wet pavement. They stopped only once more for gas and coffee before the highway began to wind toward the city. Dusk was settling over the skyline when they finally reached their destination. Clara navigated through increasingly busy streets until they reached a modest inn near the waterfront. The building was old but well-maintained, with window boxes full of hardy autumn flowers. "We'll check in here," Clara said, pulling into a parking spot. "The community center is just a few blocks away. We can walk there in the morning." Samuel stepped out of the car, stretching his stiff muscles. The air here smelled different, still salty with sea breeze, but mixed with the urban sense of restaurants and traffic. Somewhere in the distance a foghorn sounded, reminding him that even here, the water was never far away. The morning breeze carried the familiar scent of salt and seaweed as Samuel and Clara made their way along the waterfront. Sunlight danced on the gentle waves, creating sparkles that reminded Samuel of scattered diamonds. Despite the early hour, the docks were already alive with activity. Fishermen hauling in their morning catch, joggers passing by with quick nods, and seagulls swooping overhead. They rounded a corner, and Clara touched Samuel's arm gently. "There it is," she said softly. The building before them wasn't what Samuel had expected. Instead of some stark modern structure, the community center occupied what looked like an old warehouse, beautifully restored. Large windows faced the harbor, and bright blue trim highlighted the weathered brick walls. A hand-painted sign read, "Second Wind Youth Maritime Center," with a simple anchor logo beneath the words. Samuel's feet felt heavy as they approached the entrance. Through the windows, he could see movement inside, people setting up for the day's activities. Clara seemed to sense his hesitation and waited patiently beside him. "He picked this building himself," she said. "Said it was like all the boats he loved to fix, just needed someone to see its potential." Before Samuel could respond, the door swung open, and a woman in her 40s with curly red hair stepped out. Her face lit up when she saw Clara. "You made it!" she exclaimed, pulling Clara into a quick hug before turning to Samuel with warm recognition in her eyes. "And you must be Mr. Grant." "I'm Jenny Martinez, the center's director. Michael told me so much about you." Samuel blinked in surprise. "He did?" Jenny nodded, ushering them inside. "Come in, please. We've been looking forward to your visit." The interior was even more impressive than the outside. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating a space that perfectly balanced function and comfort. One wall was lined with nautical equipment, ropes, tools, and navigation instruments. Another featured a series of workbenches where Samuel could easily imagine kids learning boat repair. The air carried the pleasant mix of wood, varnish, and sea air. "This is our main workshop area," Jenny explained, leading them through. Michael designed it himself, said every kid should have a chance to create something with their own hands. They passed a group of staff members setting up for the day's programs. Each one stopped to greet them, sharing quick stories about Michael with genuine affection in their voices. Samuel found himself struggling to process it all. These people knew his son better than he ever had. Jenny led them to a small conference room where a projector was already set up. "We thought you might like to see some of what Michael did here," she said, dimming the lights. Images began to flow across the screen. Michael, younger than in Clara's photos, standing proudly beside a newly restored sailboat. Michael kneeling next to a young boy, patiently demonstrating how to sand wood. Michael at a podium, speaking passionately about youth education. "That was at our first fundraising gala," Jenny commented. "He hated public speaking, but he did it because he knew it would help the kids." Samuel watched, transfixed, as his son's life played out before him. In every image, Michael's eyes held the same determined light Samuel remembered seeing in Sarah's. But the way he worked with his hands, the careful precision he showed while teaching boat repair, Samuel recognized himself in those moments. "He never gave up on anyone," one of the staff members added from the doorway. Had this saying, "Every boat can float again, and every kid can learn to sail." Clara squeezed Samuel's hand as pride and grief washed over him in equal measure. Here was his son's legacy, not just in bricks and mortar, but in changed lives and second chances. After the presentation, Jenny encouraged them to explore the center freely. Samuel found himself drawn to a hallway lined with photos of successful students, young people standing proudly beside boats they'd helped restore, holding up certificates, heading out for their first solo sail. That's when he noticed the donor wall. It was a simple design, wooden planks arranged like a ship's hull, with names carved into each board. His eyes scanned the names until they landed on one that made his heart stop. Grant Family Foundation. The letters were clearly carved by hand, different from the professional engraving of the other names. Samuel stepped closer, running his fingers over the familiar surname. "He added that himself," Jenny said, coming to stand beside him. "Just a few months before we lost him. When I asked him about it, he said it was because everything he knew about boats, about giving people second chances, it all started with a moment at the harbor, with a man named Grant." Samuel had to turn away, overwhelmed by the weight of that simple, carved name. Clara's steady presence at his elbow helped him maintain his composure. They continued their tour, seeing the classroom where navigation was taught, the small library filled with maritime books, and finally, the dock where several small sailboats bobbed gently in their slips. "These are our training boats," Jenny explained. "The kids learn everything from basic maintenance to advanced sailing." Michael insisted on having a fleet that needed work, said the repairs were just as important as the sailing lessons. As they made their way back inside, Jenny excused herself briefly and returned carrying a cream-colored envelope. Samuel could see his name written on the front in careful handwriting. "Michael left this for you," she said softly, holding out the envelope. "Asked us to keep it safe until you came." Samuel stared at the envelope, his son's handwriting swimming before his eyes. He accepted it with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of unspoken words inside. Jenny squeezed his shoulder gently. "Take your time," she said. "You're always welcome here. This is part of your legacy too, whether you knew it or not." The modest inn-room felt smaller as evening settled in. Samuel sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress creaking softly under his weight. The envelope lay in his weathered hands, still sealed, still holding whatever truth his son had left for him. The day's fading light filtered through thin curtains, casting long shadows across the faded carpet. Clara sat quietly in the room's only chair, her presence both comforting and somehow unsettling. She hadn't said much since they'd returned from the center, seeming to understand Samuel's need for silence. His fingers traced the careful handwriting on the envelope. Michael's handwriting, his son's handwriting. The thought still felt strange, like a word repeated too many times until it lost its meaning. "Would you like me to step out?" Clara asked softly, breaking the heavy silence. Samuel shook his head. "No," he said, his voice rough. "Stay, please." With trembling fingers, he broke the seal and pulled out several sheets of paper, covered in the same neat handwriting as the envelope. He unfolded them carefully, as if they might crumble at his touch. "Dear Mr. Grant," he read aloud, then stopped, swallowing hard. Clara leaned forward slightly but remained silent. Samuel continued reading, his voice growing quieter with each word. "I've written this letter 100 times in my head, and now that I'm finally putting it on paper, I'm not sure where to begin. I suppose the simplest place is to tell you that I know who you are. I've known for several years now. It wasn't hard to find you once I started looking. The maritime industry isn't that big, and your reputation as an engineer preceded you. What surprised me was discovering that you'd been right here all along, just a few hours away. I had plans to meet you. I'd imagined dozens of ways to introduce myself, to bridge the gap between us. But then I learned something that changed everything." Samuel's hands tightened on the paper, crinkling its edges. His eyes scanned ahead, and his face went pale. "What is it?" Clara asked gently. Samuel's voice was barely above a whisper as he continued. "There was a man named James Holbrook. 28 years ago, he worked at the same shipyard as you. He had a family, a wife and 3 young children. One night, after too many drinks at the local bar, you got into an argument with him. It turned physical. He fell badly, hit his head on the corner of a table. The injury ended his career. His family struggled for years afterward. When I learned about this, I couldn't bring myself to meet you. Not because I judged you. We all have moments we wish we could take back. But because I couldn't bear to see the shame in your eyes when you realized I knew." The paper shook in Samuel's hands. He remembered that night. The anger, the alcohol, the sickening sound of James hitting the table. It was the reason he'd stopped drinking. The reason he'd thrown himself into his work, trying to atone for a moment of rage he could never take back. "I can't." Samuel's voice cracked. He stood abruptly, the letter falling to the floor. "I can't read anymore." Clara rose from her chair. "Samuel, wait. There might be more to—" "More?" He turned to her, his face twisted with pain. "My own son couldn't bear to meet me because of what I did. He knew what kind of man I was, what kind of man I am." "That's not what the letter says," Clara protested, reaching for the fallen pages. "If you just read the rest." But Samuel was already moving, pulling his small suitcase from the closet. He began throwing clothes into it haphazardly, his movements jerky and desperate. "Samuel, please," Clara tried again. "You're not seeing the whole picture. Michael wasn't." "He was right," Samuel cut her off. His voice was hollow now, drained of emotion. "Everything he built, everything he did it without me. And that's exactly how it should have been." He zipped the suitcase with sharp, angry movements. "I would have only brought shame to his legacy." Clara stepped between him and the door. "You're running away again," she said firmly. "Just like you always have. But this time, you're running from the wrong thing." Samuel stopped, his hand gripping the suitcase handle so tight his knuckles went white. For a moment, Clara thought he might listen, but then he shook his head. "I can't stay here," he said quietly. "Not in this city. Not knowing." He swallowed hard. "I need to go home." "The letter," Clara began. "Keep it," he said, his voice final. "Or throw it away. I don't want to know what else he wrote. I can't." He moved past her to the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. Behind him, Clara stood with the fallen letter in her hands, her face etched with concern and frustration. "I'm sorry," he said, not turning around. "For everything." The door opened and closed softly, leaving Clara alone in the darkening room, holding the unfinished truth in her hands. The morning sky hung like a heavy gray blanket over the coastal highway as Samuel's truck wound its way back home. He'd left the inn before sunrise, unable to face another moment in that city, unable to face Clara and the truth she kept trying to tell him. The radio hummed softly, some morning talk show he wasn't really listening to, while the windshield wipers swept away a light drizzle. His hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, knuckles white against the worn leather. Every mile marker that brought him closer to home also seemed to add another brick to the wall he was building around himself. It was better this way, he told himself. The familiar sight of his small coastal town emerged through the mist. The old water tower, the church steeple, the fishing boats dotted along the harbor. Samuel deliberately took the long way around, avoiding the waterfront where he'd spent so many years of his life. He couldn't bear to see the boats today. Couldn't stand the sight of the water that now seemed to mock him with memories of a son he'd never known. His house stood exactly as he'd left it, looking somehow smaller and more weathered than before. Inside, everything was just as it had been, the coffee cup still in the sink, the morning paper from days ago on the kitchen table, his wife's photograph watching silently from the mantel. But something had changed. The silence felt different now, heavier with the weight of what he knew. Samuel dropped his bag by the door and went through the motions of making coffee, his movements mechanical and precise. The familiar routine should have been comforting, but instead, each step felt like an act of hiding. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, but when he lifted the cup to his lips, it tasted bitter and wrong. Days began to blur together. He'd wake up, make coffee, sit in his chair and stare out the window without really seeing anything. Sometimes he'd pick up a book, only to put it down again, unable to focus on the words. The phone would ring, Clara's number appearing on the caller ID, and he'd let it go to voicemail. Each time her messages grew more urgent, more concerned, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. "Samuel, please call me back," her voice would say. "There's more you need to know. The letter, you didn't finish reading it, please." He'd delete the messages without listening to the end. One morning he found himself standing in front of the mirror, really looking at himself for the first time since returning home. The man staring back at him looked older, more tired. His eyes traced the lines on his face, wondering if any of them matched the ones his son had worn. Had Michael inherited his frown, his smile? He'd never know now. The harbor called to him like it always had, but he refused to answer. Instead of taking his usual morning walk along the waterfront, he'd turn inland, walking through the quiet residential streets where the sight of boats couldn't reach him. The few neighbors who tried to engage him in conversation were met with short, polite responses that made it clear he wasn't interested in talking. In his darker moments, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Samuel would think about James Holbrook and that terrible night at the bar. The sound of James hitting the table played over and over in his mind, mixing now with imagined images of his son discovering the truth about his father. In those moments, he'd get up and pace his small house, trying to outrun memories he couldn't escape. "You're not fit to carry his legacy," he'd tell his reflection in the darkened windows. The man who'd built that community center, who'd helped all those kids, who'd made something good of his life, that man had done it all without Samuel's influence. And maybe that had been for the best. A week passed this way, then another. The calls from Clara grew less frequent, though they didn't stop entirely. Samuel told himself this was what healing looked like, even as he felt himself sinking deeper into isolation. He was protecting his son's memory, he reasoned, by keeping his shame away from everything Michael had built. The weather began to turn, as it often did this time of year. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sharp smell of approaching rain. Samuel sat in his chair, watching the trees bend and sway outside his window. The meteorologist on the radio warned of an approaching coastal storm, advising local residents to secure any loose items and prepare for possible power outages. The storm hit just after midnight. Rain lashed against the windows, while wind howled through the eaves of the old house. Samuel lay awake in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of a coastal storm, until something changed in the radio's overnight broadcast that made him sit up straight. "Breaking news," the announcer's voice crackled through static. "Several boats have been damaged at the local marina due to the unexpected intensity of the storm. Among the affected vessels is the training boat belonging to the Youth Community Center. Local authorities are advising all residents to stay away from the waterfront until conditions improve." Samuel sat perfectly still in the darkness, listening to the wind shake his house. Somewhere out in that storm, a boat that had carried children's dreams was in trouble, a boat that in some way was part of his son's legacy. His hands, calloused from decades of marine engineering, twitched involuntarily. He knew exactly what kind of damage a storm like this could do to a training vessel, knew exactly what would need to be checked and repaired. The wind rattled the windows harder, as if demanding his attention. Samuel stared into the darkness, feeling the weight of his self-imposed exile pressing against his chest, while somewhere out there, his son's work was being threatened by the very elements Samuel had spent his life learning to master. The morning arrived gray and sullen, the storm's fury now reduced to a steady drumming of rain. Samuel sat at his kitchen table, staring into his coffee cup as if it might hold answers to questions he hadn't yet found the courage to ask. His shoulders felt heavy with a night of restless sleep. His mind still caught between the radio's news about the damaged training boat and memories of a son he'd never known. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. It was gentle but insistent, barely audible over the rain. Samuel considered ignoring it, as he had ignored so many things lately, but something in its rhythm made him rise from his chair. When he opened the door, there stood Clara. Rain dripped from her hair and coat, creating a small puddle at her feet. Her face showed the weariness of someone who had traveled far and slept little, but her eyes held the same steady determination he remembered from their first meeting. In her hands she clutched an envelope, protecting it from the rain beneath her coat. "You left before I could give you this," she said simply, her voice carrying over the sound of falling rain. Samuel stood frozen in the doorway, caught between the instinct to shut the door and the inability to turn her away. After a moment that felt much longer than it was, he stepped aside, letting her enter. Clara walked past him into the familiar kitchen, water marking her path across his floor. She didn't sit down or remove her coat, as if uncertain of her welcome. Instead, she turned to face him, still holding the envelope close. "You didn't read the whole letter, Samuel," she said softly. "You saw what you expected to see and ran before you could learn the truth." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I know enough. He found out about James Holbrook, about what I did." "No," Clara interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. "You don't know. You think Michael stayed away because he judged you for that fight. But that's not why he never came to find you." She took a step closer, and Samuel could see the emotion in her eyes. "Michael was sick, Samuel. Very sick. He'd been fighting it for years by the time he learned who you were. He didn't stay away because he was ashamed of you. He stayed away because he didn't want you to watch him die." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He gripped the back of a kitchen chair, his knees suddenly weak. "What?" Clara's voice softened. "He had the same condition that took his mother. He knew there was no cure, knew how it would end. When he finally found you, when he learned who you were and what you did for a living. He was already in the late stages. He couldn't bear the thought of finally meeting you only to leave you again. Samuel sank into the chair, his mind struggling to process this new reality. All this time he'd believed. But no, it had been something else entirely. Not judgment, but protection. Misguided, perhaps, but born of love. Clara placed the envelope on the table in front of him. Unlike the first one, this was smaller, less formal. His name was written across the front in an unsteady hand. He wrote this near the end, Clara explained. Asked me to give it to you if I ever found the right moment. After you left the city, I knew I had to bring it to you now. With trembling fingers, Samuel opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the writing cramped but clear. Dear Dad, I had your stubbornness. I had your hands. I hope you'll give them to someone who needs them when I'm gone. Michael. The simplicity of the message struck Samuel with unexpected force. He read it again, then a third time, each word embedding itself deeper in his heart. His son had seen himself in Samuel, had recognized their connection even without meeting, and in these few words, he'd left not just a message, but a request, almost a blessing. The sound of rain against the windows filled the silence as Samuel sat with the note in his hands. Something shifted inside him, like ice breaking up after a long winter. The weight he'd been carrying didn't exactly lift, but it changed shape, became something different, something that pushed him forward instead of holding him back. Clara stood quietly, giving him space to absorb the truth she'd brought. The rain continued its steady rhythm, but now it seemed less like nature's accusation and more like a cleansing force, washing away old misunderstandings and revealing new possibilities. Through the window, Samuel could just make out the harbor in the distance, where he knew his son's training boat lay damaged. He looked down at his hands, the hands his son had inherited, the hands that knew exactly how to fix what was broken. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, the sky washed clean of clouds. Samuel walked down to the harbor, his toolbox heavy in his hand. The familiar weight of it brought back memories. Decades of repairs, countless boats restored under his careful attention. But this morning felt different. The harbor was a mess. Debris littered the walkways, and several smaller vessels showed signs of storm damage. But Samuel's eyes were fixed on the training boat, the one his son's center used to teach kids about sailing. She sat awkwardly in her slip, listing slightly to port. Even from a distance, he could see where the storm had taken its toll: torn rigging, damaged railings, and what looked like a nasty gash along the starboard bow. As he got closer, Samuel set his toolbox down and ran his hand along the boat's hull. The wood was solid beneath the damage, good bones, as they said in the trade. This was something he could fix. Something he should fix. He opened his toolbox, the familiar array of tools gleaming in the morning light. Each one had its purpose, its own story of repairs made and problems solved. Samuel picked up a screwdriver, testing its weight in his hand. Then, without further hesitation, he got to work. The morning passed quietly as he assessed the damage and began the initial repairs. The rhythmic sound of his work, the scratch of sandpaper, the tap of his hammer, the whir of his drill, echoed across the water. He was so focused that he barely noticed when the first curious onlooker appeared. "What are you doing, mister?" Samuel looked up to find a boy, maybe 12, watching him intently. The kid had that look Samuel recognized from his own youth, the kind of curiosity that came from wanting to understand how things worked. "Fixing this boat," Samuel replied, then surprised himself by adding, "Want to see how?" The boy's face lit up. He scrambled closer, careful to maintain his balance on the dock. Samuel found himself explaining what he was doing as he worked, showing the boy how to identify damage and determine the best way to repair it. Before long, another child appeared, then another. Word seemed to spread through some mysterious kids' network that something interesting was happening at the harbor. Samuel discovered that explaining his work came naturally to him. the knowledge of decades flowing easily into words these young minds could grasp. "This here's called a cleat," he explained to his growing audience, holding up the metal fitting. "It's what you use to tie the boat up when you're docked. See how this one's bent? Storm did that. We need to either straighten it or replace it." "Can I help?" asked a girl with bright red hair tied in messy braids. Samuel hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Hold this end steady while I work on the other side." The morning stretched into afternoon, and Samuel found himself surrounded by eager helpers. He showed them how to sand properly, how to check for hidden damage, how to measure twice before cutting once. Their questions came rapid fire, and to his surprise, he enjoyed answering them. "Why does the wood need to be smooth? What's this tool called? How do you know which screws to use?" Each question led to an explanation, each explanation to understanding. Samuel realized he was teaching them not just about boat repair, but about patience, attention to detail, and the satisfaction of doing things right. Around noon, he heard familiar footsteps on the dock. Clara appeared, carrying a canvas bag that turned out to contain sandwiches and cold drinks. She didn't say anything, just found a spot to sit where she could watch, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The children devoured the sandwiches but quickly returned to their tasks, now self-appointed apprentice boat repairers. Samuel caught Clara's eye and gave her a nod of thanks, both for the lunch and for something deeper he couldn't quite put into words. As the afternoon wore on, the boat's transformation became visible. The gash in the hull was patched and sealed, the rigging repaired, the cleats either fixed or replaced. Samuel showed the kids how to check their work, teaching them the importance of thoroughness. "A boat's only as good as its weakest point," he told them, running his hand along a freshly repaired section. "That's why we take our time, make sure everything's done right." The sun was starting to lower in the sky when Samuel stepped back to survey their work. The training boat looked solid again, ready to fulfill its purpose of teaching young sailors. His impromptu crew of helpers gathered around him, their faces showing the same pride he felt in a job well done. Looking at their excited faces, Samuel understood something his son had known: that knowledge passed on was knowledge doubled, that teaching was its own kind of legacy. These kids might not remember every technical detail he'd shown them today, but they'd remember the feeling of accomplishment, the importance of doing things right, the satisfaction of fixing something broken. The boat sat properly in the water now, no longer listing, its repairs complete. Samuel closed his toolbox, the sound drawing the attention of his young helpers. "Is it fixed?" one of them asked. "She's seaworthy again," Samuel confirmed, patting the hull. "Ready for the youth regatta." The morning of the regatta arrived with perfect sailing weather. A gentle breeze carried the salty scent of the ocean across the harbor, and the sky stretched endlessly blue above. Samuel stood on the dock early, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold. The repaired training boat bobbed gently in its slip, its freshly sealed wood gleaming in the morning light. He ran his hand along the smooth railing, remembering the hours spent working on her with those eager kids. Every repair told a story. The replaced cleat where Jimmy had learned about leverage, the carefully sanded section where Sarah had shown surprising patience, the new rigging that Mark had helped install, while asking endless questions about knots and sailing terms. The sound of excited chatter broke through his thoughts. The young sailors were arriving, their parents in tow, all bundled up against the morning chill. Samuel spotted familiar faces among them. His impromptu repair crew, now dressed in life jackets and wearing determined expressions. "Mr. Grant," called out Sarah, her red braids bouncing as she ran down the dock. "Is she ready? Did you check everything again?" Samuel couldn't help but smile. "Checked her twice this morning. She's ready to show what she can do." More children gathered around, their excitement palpable. Some were experienced young sailors who had raced before, while others were newcomers, nervous but eager. Samuel found himself naturally falling into the role of instructor, gathering them around to go over last-minute checks. "Remember what we talked about while making repairs?" he said, demonstrating the proper way to check the rigging, Everything needs to be just right before you launch. Take your time and do it properly. Clara appeared on the dock, carrying a thermos of what Samuel guessed was coffee. She hung back, watching as he worked with the kids. He caught her eye briefly and saw approval in her warm smile. The harbor was coming alive now. Other boats were being prepared, their sails catching the early morning light. Parents helped their children with final preparations, and race officials moved about with clipboards, checking registrations and going over safety procedures. "All right," Samuel announced to his crew. "Let's get her ready to launch." The next few minutes were organized chaos as the children worked together, each remembering their assigned tasks from practice. Samuel moved among them, his steady hands guiding when needed, offering quiet words of encouragement or gentle corrections. "Easy with that line," he cautioned Jimmy, who was eager but still learning to handle the ropes. "Remember how we practiced, smooth and steady." The boy nodded, adjusting his grip and trying again. This time the movement was perfect, and Samuel gave him an approving nod. Sarah was already in position, her small hands confident on the tiller. She'd shown a natural talent for sailing during practice sessions, and Samuel had no doubt she'd do well today. The other children took their positions, faces serious with concentration. "Ready?" Samuel asked, looking at each young sailor in turn. They nodded, and he felt a surge of pride at their determination. These weren't just kids anymore. They were a crew, working together, supporting each other, just as his son would have wanted. With practiced ease, Samuel helped them guide the boat away from the dock. Other vessels were launching too, creating a colorful parade of sails and excited young voices. The morning air was filled with shouts of encouragement from parents and the flutter of flags in the breeze. "Remember what we practiced," he called out as they prepared to set sail. "Trust each other and trust the boat. She'll take care of you." The children beamed with pride. It was their boat too now, after all those hours helping with repairs. They had learned every inch of her, understood her strengths, knew how she would respond to wind and wave. Samuel stepped back onto the dock, watching as they adjusted the sails just as he'd taught them. The boat responded beautifully, gliding smoothly through the water. All those hours of careful repair work had paid off. She moved like a dream, ready to give these young sailors their chance to shine. Clara appeared at his side, offering him a cup of coffee. "They look good out there," she said softly. Samuel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. These kids had done more than just help fix a boat. They'd helped him find his way back to who he was meant to be. He watched as they maneuvered toward the starting line, their faces focused and excited. Other boats gathered around them, sails billowing in the morning breeze. Parents called out final encouragements, and race officials began their preparations. The harbor was alive with energy and possibility. The training boat looked magnificent among the others, her restored wood catching the sunlight. But it wasn't just the physical repairs that made her special. It was the spirit of cooperation and learning that had gone into her restoration. Every repair had been a lesson, every moment of work a chance to pass on knowledge. Samuel felt Clara's presence beside him, steady and understanding. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from isolation to connection, from loss to purpose. He thought about his son, who had understood the importance of giving back, of teaching, of building something that would last beyond a single lifetime. The starting horn sounded across the water. Sails filled with wind as the young crews began their race. Samuel watched his team work together seamlessly, just as they'd practiced. Sarah's sure hand on the tiller, Jimmy's confident handling of the ropes, all of them moving in coordination. Laughter and shouts carried across the water as the boats picked up speed. Parents and spectators lined the docks, cheering and calling encouragement. The morning sun painted everything in bright, hopeful colors, and the breeze carried the promise of possibility. Standing there, watching these young sailors he'd helped train, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A sense of belonging, of being exactly where he was meant to be. This wasn't just about boats or sailing or even teaching. It was about continuing something important, something his son had started. He turned to Clara, who was watching him with that gentle understanding in her eyes. The words came naturally, without thought or hesitation. "I think I've finally come home," he said quietly. Clara's hand found his, warm and reassuring. Together, they stood on the dock, watching the sails catch the wind, carrying dreams and hopes across the sparkling water. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to this channel.